Among the many fictional nations of Runeterra, Ionia stands out as being particularly special. It is a land where spirit magic is abundantly potent, a land where the very veil between the realms of mortals and spirits is thinner than just about anywhere else. The people of Ionia have learned to incorporate this magic into aspects of their daily lives, literally growing trees in the shapes of houses rather than cutting them down for lumber, or making offerings to the sea in exchange for its bounty rather than traditional fishing. One of the most interesting ways that Ionians use magic, though, is in their fighting styles. Where most magic users on Runeterra will settle for simply casting spells, many Ionians have instead developed entire martial arts that use magic more as a means to supplement their techniques. Today, I want to take a look at some of these fighting styles, everything we know about them, and perhaps even consider their effectiveness overall. With all that out of the way, let's begin. The first fighting style to look at is probably the most well-known. The wind technique is a school of swordsmanship that, as you can guess, makes use of wind magic. The core principle behind this technique seems to be swift movements, using the wind to extend your blade's reach or to strengthen your strikes in the process. More than that, though, one can use the sword as a catalyst to unleash spiraling tornadoes, or even updrafts that act as barriers. Then, of course, there's the most deadly move in the wind technique's arsenal, a flurry of 3 swift strikes after breaking your opponent's defenses with a gust of air. Allegedly, the wind technique is extraordinarily difficult to master, so much so that the only known living wielder is Yasuo, whose natural talent allowed him to learn it from Elder Soma. Until or unless he finds a pupil, it's possible that the wind technique may become a lost art, provided there aren't scrolls or something that one could study to relearn it. The real question is whether or not one has to be born with the talent for wind magic to study this technique, or if theoretically anyone could use it with enough time and practice. Without question, though, this technique is not one to be taken lightly, as Yasuo has fended off nothing short of small armies coming after him with his blade and the wind alone. Wuju has something of an interesting history to it. It's technically existed in the lore since League's launch, as the signature fighting style of Master Yi. In spite of that, we've never really gotten too much info on the specifics of how wuju works or what it actually is. Perhaps that's fitting, as wuju in the current lore is supposedly such a powerful art that even most Ionians don't know about it, outside of the secluded village where it was practiced. In all honesty, wuju seems to be more than just a fighting style. For one thing, there doesn't seem to be any specific weapon tied to it. Rather, wuju's core philosophy appears to revolve around an attunement or understanding of nature and the natural world. In fact, it appears that the art was actually inspired by a spirit we simply know as the spirit of wuju, fittingly enough, whose many eyes can see into different facets of a person's being, from their emotions to their memories to their personality and so forth. Students of wuju often wear special lenses that are meant to mimic the spirit's sight, though the technique for making them appears to have been all but lost with the passing of Master Doran. Even though wuju isn't explicitly a fighting style, it certainly is quite deadly in combat. Used offensively, one can augment their weapon or even their bodies with spirit magic. This allows users to strike harder and faster, but also heal wounds and even recover stamina more quickly. The Alpha Strike is a technique that allows one to move so fast they practically become invisible, though this is an extremely dangerous move that apparently runs the risk of seriously harming or even killing the user if they aren't prepared for it. One can also summon spiritual duplicates, though the exact limits of this power aren't entirely clear. One thing that is clear, though, is that wuju is an extremely versatile and extraordinarily deadly art in the right hands. I mean, Yi was able to single-handedly decimate entire Noxian battalions with it, to the point that they just bombarded his entire village out of fear once they learned the possibility that there were other warriors like him. In all likelihood, wuju is an even more formidable art than the wind technique, though it also has precious few wielders left due to the aforementioned war crimes. Alright, so this one is by far the most vague and dubious technique on the list. Irelia's art, called blade dancing, is actually an offshoot from an Ionian form of dance called silk dancing. As the name implies, this technique was meant more so for entertainment and self-expression. But since many real-life martial arts are actually based on dancing, it's no surprise that the technique could be applicable in combat. Silk dancing is pretty self-explanatory. The user dances with silk streamers that bend and flow along with their movements. Many of Irelia's followers and allies use this technique for battle by attaching sharp blades to the ends and edges of the ribbons, effectively making them into pseudo-whip-like weapons. The technique utilizes a lot of graceful flowing movements, and no doubt requires a bit of flexibility and agility from the user. Where things really start to get complicated, though, is when we try to take a look at Irelia herself. She was trained in silk dancing from a young age, and was told all her life that the dance has some kind of vaguely defined spiritual power. Those stories proved true when Irelia's family crest, which happens to conveniently be made of various small sharp edges, was shattered in front of her by Noxian soldiers after they slaughtered her family. Irelia was able to defend herself by controlling these blades, somehow, and now fights by controlling them through the same technique she learned as a child. The popular theory is that Irelia is actually a ferromancer, or metal mage, similar to Rel. This would imply that she's actually just incorporating ferromancy into her dance techniques as a fighting style, but could theoretically control other metals and not just blades. Unfortunately, this assumption becomes rather complicated when you recall that Rise of the Sentinels event, in which Irelia was controlling relic stone blades in place of her metal ones. Believe me, I'd rather ignore that event as much as anyone, but it is unfortunately canon, so we have to take into consideration that Irelia's powers are tied to something other than metal manipulation. Sadly, there's really not much of an explanation beyond the fact that this dance technique somehow has some innate spiritual power that simply hasn't been elaborated on. As it stands, Irelia is still the only one we know of who can properly blade dance, and given that her blades come from her family's crest, maybe it's a power that can only be passed down through her bloodline? Sadly, that's all we know at the moment, so let's just move on. Tempest style is another weird one to talk about because we also don't really know too much about it. It's a technique that Kennen and his students have studied, though it seems to be less of a single art and more a collection of different disciplines all existing under one umbrella school. The core idea seems to be studying different elements that one would associate with storms: wind, lightning, thunder, clouds, and even wildfires. Though, curiously, we haven't seen any water mages in this school, despite rain being an obvious component to go for. Each of these branches clearly has its own fighting style associated with it. Lightning relies more on speedy movements that involve zipping in and out of combat, whereas thunder relies more on raw strength and blunt force. Wind focuses on harnessing and weaponizing the breath in one's own lungs, while tornado seems to focus on controlling the surrounding air. Seems kind of redundant, but okay. Then, of course, there's Embers, which is a fighting style that seems to involve self-immolation. And that's about all we really know about that one. Cloud weaving is probably the most notable one, though. Not only can you summon clouds to ride on, but you can also fashion them into kaiju and who even really knows what else to fight on your behalf. Ultimately, though, cloud weaving is just one of many techniques available to those who study under the school of Tempest. Considered forbidden by many, the shadow technique is nonetheless one of the most potent and deadly arts on this list, which is saying a lot. It makes use of both the spiritual and elemental aspects of magic to achieve all manner of things, from literally merging oneself with darkness to invading and altering dreams. I mean, Nocturne was even made from shadow magic, so it's definitely not something to meddle with lightly. No pun intended. And yet, Zed has founded an entire order focusing on using and mastering shadow magic. With it, one can create shadowy copies, phase through physical matter, and even alter one's own body. Remember, though, that shadow magic is extremely difficult to control, and can even potentially corrupt the user's own mind if they aren't careful. It's an art that demands much to master and may take more than it gives. But for those pursuing pure lethality, there are few better choices. Last on our list is another self-explanatory power, spirit channeling. As the name implies, this technique allows one to harness the power of a spirit, or even spirits, through their own bodies. It's a technique also known and studied in the Freljord, but Ionians have their own spin on the practice. Perhaps the most notable practitioner is Lee Sin, who appears to have founded his own school around channeling dragon spirits specifically. This technique requires great mental and physical fortitude to master. One must achieve a sort of balance with the spirit they aim to harness, lest its power threaten to overwhelm the wielder. Most Ionian spirit channelers seem to prefer some sort of hand-to-hand combat, which makes sense given that spirits seem to empower their vessels more so than any weapon. Karma could also be considered an example of this, though she's something of a unique case given that she just wields pure spirit energy. So yeah, those are all the Ionian fighting styles and techniques that we currently know about, at least enough to make a video. As a whole, the idea of blending magic with martial arts is a really neat premise, and it's kind of criminal how little Riot has actually properly explored this idea. Hopefully we'll get to learn more in the future, but for now, what do you guys think? Which technique is your favorite? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I'll see you all next time.